In 1908, they left him behind to die. No food, no shelter, no boat coming back. Abandoned alone on a forgotten island, the slave was expected to disappear into the ocean wind and salt air, like so many before him. But days became months. Months turned into years, and somehow, against hunger, storms, isolation, and madness, he survived. For 20 years, he lived with nothing but his will, crafting tools from wreckage, finding water where none should exist, and learning the language of birds, tides, and silence. This is the unbelievable true story of the man who was meant to be erased, and instead became impossible to kill. The storm had passed 3 days ago, leaving the island scrubbed clean beneath a merciless sun. Marcus stood at the rocky outcrop on the western shore, his bare feet planted on stone, worn smooth by centuries of waves, watching the horizon with eyes that no longer expected deliverance. 20 years had etched themselves into his face like the weathering of driftwood. Deep lines around his eyes, a bird shot through with silver, skin darkened to the color of old leather by sun and salt. He was 48 years old, though he'd lost exact count somewhere in the middle years. The boy who had arrived on this island at 28 existed now only in fragments of memory, like dreams half remembered upon waking. It was 1908 by his best reckoning, 20 years since the slaver's ship had left him here to die. The island, he'd named it São Tomás after his father, was perhaps 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, a volcanic remnant thrust from the Atlantic Ocean somewhere off the coast of West Africa. Marcus had been one of 47 souls chained in the hold of the Esperança, a Portuguese slaving vessel, making its final illegal run in an age when such commerce was nominally abolished but still practiced in the shadows of empire. He remembered the fever that had swept through the hold. He remembered the fear in the slaver's eyes, when man after man succumbed to the sweating sickness. And he remembered the morning when the hatch opened and rough hands had dragged him, delirious, burning with fever, and thrown him into a longboat with 3 others who showed symptoms. They had rowed him to this island and left him on the beach with no tools, no food, no water, just his dying body and the clothes on his back. The slavers had shouted something in Portuguese as they rowed away. He didn't speak the language, but he understood the sentiment. They were cutting their losses. The fever had made him worthless cargo. The other 3 men had died within 2 days. Marcus had buried them as best he could, with his bare hands in the volcanic soil, digging shallow graves while his own body shook with chills. He should have died too. Every rational expectation said he would, but he hadn't. Those initial months existed in his memory as a blur of desperate hunger and maddening thirst. The fever had broken after a week, leaving him weak as a newborn, but alive. The island's meager resources had revealed themselves slowly, grudgingly, like a puzzle that demanded to be solved or else. Fresh water came from a spring that bubbled up in a cave on the northern side of the island, hidden behind a curtain of vine-like vegetation. He'd found it on the edge of death from thirst, following the calls of seabirds that gathered there at dawn. That discovery had been his first miracle. Food had been harder. The island supported little animal life, some lizards, countless crabs that scuttled among the rocks, seabirds that nested in the cliffs. He'd learned to catch crabs with his hands, smashing them on rocks and eating the meat raw. The birds' eggs became precious finds, discovered during dangerous climbs up sheer cliff faces. He'd fallen once, breaking 2 ribs that had healed crooked, leaving him with a permanent hitch in his breathing. Fish had required tools, and tools had required time and ingenuity. He'd taught himself to knap volcanic rock into crude blades, cutting his hands 100 times before developing the technique. With stone blades, he could sharpen sticks into spears. With spears, he could hunt the fish that gathered in the tide pools during low tide. The first fish he'd speared, a silvery thing the length of his forearm, had made him weep with joy and grief in equal measure. Joy for the sustenance, grief for how far he'd fallen from humanity. He was becoming something else, something primitive and alone. Fire had been the great challenge of his second year. He'd tried every method he could remember or imagine, striking rocks together, rubbing sticks, using dried moss as tinder. The breakthrough had come accidentally when he'd been knapping stone near a patch of dry grass. A spark from the volcanic rock had caught, and he'd spent an hour coaxing that tiny ember into flame with trembling hands and held breath. After that, he'd kept a fire burning constantly in a sheltered cave on the eastern shore, feeding it with driftwood and dried seaweed, terrified to let it die. That fire had been his companion, his hope, his connection to civilization. He talked to it sometimes in those early years, the only voice he heard being his own. Shelter had evolved over time. First, a crude lean-to of palm fronds against a rock face. Then, a more substantial hut framed with driftwood and thatched with woven grass. Eventually, he'd made the cave with the eternal fire his home, improving it with stone walls and a door of woven vines that kept out the worst of the weather. But it was the loneliness that nearly killed him. Not hunger, not thirst, not the infections that sometimes festered in cuts and scrapes. The absence of human contact. He'd created a companion from a gourd, drawing a face on it with charred wood, naming it Thomas after his brother. He'd talked to Thomas for 3 years before the absurdity of it struck him one morning, and he'd hurled the gourd into the ocean in a rage of self-disgust. After that, he'd stopped talking altogether for nearly a year, letting his voice rust away into silence. Somewhere in the middle years, year 7 or 8 perhaps, Marcus had made a choice. He could continue to merely survive, waiting for a rescue that would never come, or he could live. It was a subtle distinction but a profound one. He'd begun to observe the island not as a prison, but as a world unto itself, complex and structured and beautiful in its own harsh way. He'd noticed that the crabs were more abundant during certain moon phases. He'd learned that fish migrated around the island in seasonal patterns. He discovered which seaweeds were edible and which caused stomach cramps. He'd found that certain volcanic rocks, when struck together in just the right way, produced not just sparks, but different colors in the flame. He'd created a calendar of sorts, marking days with notches on a piece of driftwood. After a few years, when the wood became too scored to hold more marks, he'd switched to a different system, building small cairns of stones, one for each passing of the seasons. By his count, there were now 20 such cairns arranged in a circle near his cave. His daily routine had become ritualized. Wake at dawn with the seabirds, check the fish traps he'd woven from vines and weighted with stones in the shallow reef, tend the fire, forage for crabs and edible plants. In the afternoon, work on projects, weaving baskets, knapping new tools, improving his shelter, exploring some previously unexamined corner of the island. In the evening, watch the sunset from the western outcrop, then return to the cave to eat and sleep. He taught himself dozens of skills through trial and error. how to weave palm fronds into waterproof mats, how to cure fish by smoking them over slow fires, how to make rope from twisted plant fibers, how to predict weather by reading the clouds and the behavior of birds, how to navigate by the stars, though there was nowhere to navigate to. His body had changed. The soft flesh of civilization had been burned and starved away, leaving him lean and hard, all wire and sinew. His hands were thick with calluses. His feet had toughened until he could walk barefoot across sharp volcanic rock. Scars told the story of his learning. The crooked ribs from his fall, the white line across his forearm where a stone blade had slipped, the puckered mark on his shoulder where a seabird had attacked him when he'd climbed too close to its nest. His mind had changed too. The constant internal dialogue that had characterized his thinking in the old world had quieted. He'd learned to exist in long stretches of pure awareness, simply being present with the wind and waves and sun. Thoughts came less frequently, but more clearly, like fish rising to the surface of still water. He'd realized, somewhere in year 12 or 13, that he was content, not happy. Happiness required a certain context, other people, the possibility of change and choice. But content. He'd mastered his environment. He had food, water, shelter. He was alive when he should have been dead. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been born into slavery in Virginia, escaped as a young man only to be recaptured and sold onto the Esperanza, and now lived freer than he'd ever been, albeit utterly alone on a speck of rock in the middle of the ocean. The ship appeared on the horizon in the dry season of what Marcus calculated to be his 19th year on the island. He was checking his fish traps when he saw it. A smudge of smoke against the clear blue sky, growing larger as the vessel approached. His first reaction was terror. Ships meant people, and people had never brought him anything but suffering. The men who'd enslaved him, beaten him, chained him, and finally abandoned him had all come from ships. He'd scrambled back to his cave and watched from concealment as the vessel drew closer. It was a small merchant steamer, probably Portuguese or Spanish, making its way along the African coast. It didn't approach the island directly, but passed perhaps 2 miles offshore, close enough that Marcus could make out figures moving on the deck. Every instinct screamed at him to signal them, to light a signal fire, to run to the beach, to wave and shout. This was rescue. This was salvation. This was the return to humanity he'd dreamed about for years. But he didn't move. He watched the ship pass, his hands gripping the stone wall of his cave, his breath coming in short gasps. The opportunity slipped away, minute by minute, mile by mile, until the smoke disappeared over the horizon and the ocean was empty again. That night, Marcus sat before his fire, trying to understand his own inaction. Fear had been part of it, fear of what humans might do to him. But there was something else too. He'd built a life here, a simple life, a hard life, but one that was entirely his own. No master, no chains, no one to tell him where to go or what to do. The island had become his home. The thought disturbed him deeply. Over the following weeks, he found himself thinking constantly about the ship and his choice not to signal it. Had he made a terrible mistake? Had his long isolation damaged his mind in ways he couldn't perceive? Or had he simply recognized a truth about himself, that he valued his freedom, even in isolation, more than the uncertain promise of returning to a world that had only ever enslaved him? He had no answer. But the question gnawed at him. The storms of the wet season in Marcus's 20th year were particularly fierce. For 3 days and nights, the wind howled around his cave while rain fell in sheets that turned the island's gullies into torrents. Marcus huddled inside, feeding his fire and listening to the ocean rage against the rocks. When the storm finally broke, he emerged to find the island transformed. A section of the western cliff had collapsed into the sea. Uprooted vegetation lay scattered everywhere. And there, tangled in the rocks of the southern beach, was wreckage. Marcus approached cautiously. It was the remains of a longboat, shattered by the storm, and sprawled on the beach, one arm reaching toward the water, was a body. He was a young man, perhaps 25, dark-skinned like Marcus, wearing the ragged remnants of sailor's clothes. Marcus knelt beside him and found, impossibly, a pulse, weak and thready, but present. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus heard his own voice directed at another human being. "Can you hear me?" The words came out cracked and strange, his vocal cords rusty from disuse. The young man's eyes fluttered open. He stared at Marcus, at his wild beard, his weathered face, his improvised clothes of woven grass and fish leather, with an expression of confusion and fear. "Agua," the young man whispered. "Water." Marcus ran to his spring and returned, with water in a gourd. He lifted the stranger's head and helped him drink, watching the life slowly come back into his eyes. The stranger's name was Daniel. Over the next days, as Marcus nursed him back to health with fish broth and fresh water, the story emerged in fragments. Daniel had been crew on a merchant vessel that had foundered in the storm. He'd been in a longboat with 3 others, trying to reach the African coast when the seas had swamped them. He didn't know if any of the others had survived. "Where are we?" Daniel asked on the 3rd day, strong enough now to sit up and take in his surroundings. "An island," Marcus said. "I don't know its proper name. I've been here 20 years. Daniel's eyes widened. 20 years, alone. Until now. Daniel stayed in Marcus's cave while he recovered his strength. It was strange having another person in his space. Strange hearing a voice other than his own. Strange having to think about another's needs and presence, but also wonderful in ways Marcus had forgotten. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal, the sound of laughter, the exchange of stories. Daniel told him about the world beyond the island, how slavery had been abolished throughout most of the world, though pockets of bondage still existed, how new technologies were transforming life, machines that could fly, devices that could transmit voices across vast distances, how nations were positioning themselves for conflicts that some feared might engulf the entire globe. Marcus told Daniel about his 20 years, about the fever, the desperate first months, the slow accumulation of skills and knowledge, the ship he'd let pass by. "Why didn't you signal them?" Daniel asked. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I don't know if I can explain it," he finally said. "Fear, perhaps. Or maybe I'd just learned to be alone. This island, it's been a hard home, but it's been mine." "And now?" Daniel asked. "What will you do now?" 3 weeks after Daniel's arrival, another ship appeared. This time, it was Daniel who saw it first, calling out excitedly from the western outcrop. Marcus stood beside him, watching the vessel approach. It was smaller than the merchant steamer from the year before, perhaps a coastal trader or fishing vessel. It was close enough that they could signal it if they chose. "We have to try," Daniel said. "This could be our only chance." "Your chance," Marcus corrected gently. You need to get back to the world. Your family will think you dead. You have a life waiting. And you don't? Marcus smiled, an expression that felt strange on his weathered face. I have a life. It's here. You can't be serious. 20 years alone, and now you choose to stay? I wouldn't be alone. You'd be here too if you chose to stay. Daniel stared at him. You're asking me to give up everything. My family, my home, the whole world. No, Marcus said quietly. I'm asking you to make a choice. The same choice I'm making. They stood in silence, watching the ship draw closer. Marcus could see Daniel struggling with the decision, understanding for the first time what Marcus had learned over 20 years. That freedom was sometimes indistinguishable from exile. That home was wherever you built it, and that every choice involved a kind of death. I can't stay, Daniel finally said, his voice thick with emotion. I have to try to get back, but I understand why you're staying. I think I really do. Marcus nodded. He'd expected nothing else. He helped Daniel gather driftwood and build a signal fire on the highest point of the island. They piled on green vegetation to create thick smoke, then waited. The ship altered course, turning toward the island. As they stood together watching it approach, Daniel suddenly gripped Marcus's arm. Come with me, he said urgently. Please, you've survived this long. You deserve to live the rest of your life among people, in freedom. Marcus looked at the younger man, seeing in his face a reflection of who he himself had been 20 years ago, still believing that salvation could come from outside, that freedom was something granted by circumstance rather than claimed from within. I am free, Marcus said. For the first time in my life, I'm truly free. This island isn't my prison. It's the place where I learned to be my own master. The ship drew close enough now that they could see sailors on the deck, pointing toward the smoke. A longboat was being lowered. Marcus embraced Daniel, feeling the strangeness of human contact after so many years. Tell them whatever story you want about finding me here. Tell them I was mad, if that makes it easier. But know this, I made my choice with a clear mind and a full heart. I'll tell them the truth, Daniel promised. I'll tell them about the most remarkable man I ever met. The longboat reached the shore. Portuguese sailors climbed out, calling questions. Daniel turned to Marcus one last time. Will you at least come down to the beach to see them? Marcus shook his head. I've said my goodbye to that world. Go on. Live well. He watched from the outcrop as Daniel descended to the beach, as the sailors helped him into the longboat, as they rowed back to the ship. He watched as Daniel looked back toward the island, shading his eyes against the sun, perhaps hoping to catch one last glimpse of the hermit who'd chosen exile over rescue. Then the ship raised anchor and turned away, carrying Daniel back to civilization and leaving Marcus alone once more on his island. That night, Marcus sat before his fire, as he had on countless nights before. But something had changed. The island felt different now, not emptier, but fuller. Daniel's brief presence had reminded him of what it meant to be human in the company of others, and that memory would live with him. But it had also confirmed what he'd learned over 20 years, that he'd found something on this island, more valuable than rescue. He'd found autonomy, self-reliance, the deep satisfaction of a life lived entirely on his own terms. He was no longer Marcus the slave, defined by his bondage. Nor was he Marcus the castaway, defined by his abandonment. He was simply Marcus, master of himself and of São Tomás, living each day as it came with the skills he'd learned and the wisdom he'd earned. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the tropical night. Somewhere in the darkness, crabs scuttled among the rocks and waves whispered against the shore. The island breathed around him, familiar and eternal. Marcus added another piece of driftwood to the flames and settled back against the cave wall. Tomorrow, he would check his fish traps, tend to his garden of edible plants, perhaps explore the newly reshaped western cliffs. There would be work to do, as there always was, but it would be work of his own choosing in service to no one but himself. He closed his eyes and smiled. For the first time in his life, he was home.